Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 12, verse 27, which reads, "Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth." Whew. Man. Look, I wanted to unpack this verse because we live in a culture that has a complicated relationship with effort, especially myself. It's bad. But, on one hand, hustle culture is everywhere, telling us to grind 24/7, sleep when we're dead, and measure our worth by our productivity. On the other hand, there's a growing counter movement that celebrates doing the bare minimum, quiet quitting, and treating ambition itself as something to be suspicious of. But Proverbs 12:27 here does not side with either extreme. It is not a motivational poster telling us to outwork everyone in the room, but it's also not giving us permission to coast. It is making a much more grounded and practical observation about the relationship between effort and outcome, and it does so through one of the most vivid and oddly specific images in the entire Bible. Right? A hunter who goes out, tracks his game, makes the kill, and then cannot be bothered to cook it. He comes home with the raw material for a meal and lets it sit there. And so, that picture is actually almost funny until you realize how many areas of your own life it might literally describe. And that is exactly what makes it so effective. And so, let's break down the verse, right? Let's just break down the verse here. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game. So the word slothful here describes someone who is lazy in a very specific way. It is not the laziness of someone who never starts anything. It is the laziness of someone who starts, gets partway through, and then stops before finishing. The hunter in this image did the hard part, right? Hunting in the ancient world was not a casual afternoon activity. It required skill, patience, physical endurance, and real risk. And so he went out and he succeeded, but then at the final step, he could not follow through. So this is a clarification the verse really needs, because most people read slothful and picture someone who never gets off the freaking couch, right? But Solomon is describing a more subtle and more common form of laziness, the kind that shows up not at the beginning of something, but right before the finish line. So the hunt was done, the kill was made, and all that remained was the roasting. And that last step, the one that converts the effort into actual nourishment, never even happened. So, think about how many areas of life this describes, right? The person who studies for an exam but does not bother reviewing their notes the night before. The person who starts a fitness routine and gives it up 3 weeks in when initial motivation fades. The person who has a genuinely good idea at work but never puts in the effort to actually develop and present it. In every case, the game was caught, but the roasting never happened. And by the way, guys, I've been all of that. I've done all of that before. Shame on me, man. But anyways, in the next chapter, Proverbs 13 is going to reinforce this from a slightly different angle. We're not going to unpack this, but I just want to give it for context. It says, "The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied." So the sluggard is not without desire. He craves. He wants the outcome. He just consistently stops short of doing what would actually produce it. So the craving and the follow-through are two entirely separate things, and the slothful person has plenty of the first and almost none of the second. So there is also something worth noting about what the slothful person loses here beyond just the meal itself. Raw game doesn't keep, right? By failing to roast what he caught, the hunter does not just delay his dinner. He wastes it entirely. The cost of incomplete follow-through is not just a delayed reward, it's a forfeited one. Whatever was caught spoils. So the opportunity cost of slothfulness is not neutral. It is literally actively destructive. But now I want to talk about the part where it says, "But the diligent man will get precious wealth." Because the contrast Solomon draws is striking, because he does not just say the diligent man will finish what he starts, though that is implied. But he says that the diligent man will get precious wealth. And so the reward described here goes well beyond the immediate task. The word precious here is the same word used elsewhere in Proverbs for things that are genuinely rare and valuable, things that cannot be easily replaced or casually obtained. Solomon is saying that consistent diligence compounds into something significantly more valuable than the sum of its individual tasks. Right? The diligent man who roasts his game today builds the habit, the skill, the reputation, and the resources that accumulate over time into something that deserves the word precious. So this is where the verse connects to a principle that shows up throughout both Proverbs and the New Testament. Right? Diligence is not just about completing tasks. It's about the kind of character that task completion builds over time. Earlier in the book, in Proverbs 10:4, it makes the economic dimension of this pretty explicit, where it says, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. And then later in the book, in 21:5, it adds the element of planning. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And so, Jesus picks up the same principle in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25:14-30. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh, yeah. The servants who took what they were given and worked with it received more. The one who buried his talent out of fear and inaction lost even what he had. So the master's summary in verse 29 is essentially a New Testament version of this verse, right? He says, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And so diligence produces abundance, and slothfulness produces loss. The pattern is consistent across the entire biblical witness. One more clarification is worth making here, though, because the precious wealth the diligent man obtains is not exclusively financial. While material provision is certainly part of what Proverbs has in mind, the broader context of the book makes clear that the wealth being described includes reputation, wisdom, strong relationships, and the kind of character that holds up under pressure. And so these are all things that diligence builds and slothfulness erodes, often in ways that are invisible until the erosion has gone very, very deep. And so let's get practical here. Let's get applicable here, right? Because, I actually believe that this is where knowledge turns into action. Probably the most important part of our Christian walk. So the first thing is to identify where we are leaving our game unroasted. The most honest application of this verse is not about whether we're working hard enough in general. It's about identifying the specific areas where we have done the hard part and are consistently stopping short of finishing. Most of us have at least one or two of these, right? A project that is 80% done, a habit we start every few months and abandon, a relationship we know needs a difficult conversation that we keep deferring. So the game has been caught, yes, but we just have not built the fire. And so naming those specific areas concretely is the first step towards actually addressing them. And then the second thing is to build the discipline of follow-through as a character trait, not just a productivity habit. What Solomon is ultimately describing in this verse is not a time management problem. It is a character issue. The diligent man that does not just complete tasks. He's the kind of person who completes tasks, and that identity shapes everything downstream. Practically, this means treating follow-through as something we are actively cultivating in ourselves rather than just something we try to do when motivation is high. Starting small and finishing consistently is more formative than starting big and abandoning it halfway. So every time we roast the game we have caught, we are reinforcing a version of ourselves that will show up more reliably the next time the follow-through gets hard. And the last thing is to take the long view on what diligence is actually building. One of the reasons slothfulness is so tempting is that the gap between effort and reward is rarely immediate. The diligent man's precious wealth does not appear overnight. It accumulates. And in the short term, stopping short of the finish line often feels like a reasonable trade-off for rest, comfort, or the pursuit of something else. Proverbs 12:27 basically asks us to zoom out and see what consistent follow-through is actually building over time, and equally, what consistent slothfulness is actually costing. The hunter who never roasts his game does not just miss one meal. He trains himself into a pattern that will produce empty-handed seasons for as long as the pattern holds. And so seeing the long-term stakes of our daily habits of follow-through is one of the most motivating things we can do. So let me just give a closing thought here. Proverbs 12, excuse me, Proverbs 12:27 is funny on the surface and devastating underneath. A hunter who cannot be bothered to cook his own kill is almost absurd as an image, but Solomon chose it deliberately because the absurdity is the point. From the outside, slothfulness at the final step looks obviously foolish, but from the inside, in the moment when the hard work is already done and the finish line requires one more push, it feels completely reasonable to stop. And so wisdom is the capacity to see ourselves from the outside in those moments, to recognize that the game is caught and the only thing standing between us and the meal is the willingness to build the fire. So remember, the diligent man builds the fire every time. And over a lifetime, that habit becomes precious wealth.